General Hospital will reveal after months of intense speculation, mounting tension, and a whirlwind of theories surrounding the fate of Michael Corinthos on General Hospital. All doubts were finally put to rest in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The latest episode ignited a firestorm across social media platforms when, in an utterly jaw-dropping twist, Michael made his long-anticipated return during the grand spectacle of the Nurses' Ball. Port Charles's most prestigious and emotional annual event. Fans had spent weeks wondering whether a new actor such as Rory Gibson or former Michael portrayer Drew Garrett would step into the iconic role. Whispers about potential recasts, casting calls, and even cryptic social media follows between actors had only fueled the fire of uncertainty. Yet in a single breathtaking moment, the truth was revealed. Chad Duell had never truly walked away from the role, and Michael had never really left the battlefield of power, betrayal, and passion that defines life in Port Charles. The reveal was nothing short of cinematic brilliance. Throughout recent episodes, viewers were teased with mysterious glimpses of a man aboard a private jet, his face hidden, his identity shrouded in secrecy. For days, this image lingered in the collective imagination of fans, sparking endless debates and guesses. But then, as the camera panned in on a shadowed figure emerging from backstage at the Nurses' Ball, the crowd both on screen and off was left breathless. With piercing eyes, a confident stride, and a presence that commanded the room without a single spoken word, Chad Duell stepped into the light as Michael Corinthos. There were no fancy special effects, no bombastic music cues. Just the raw, potent shock of recognition and the immediate realization that Michael's return was not merely a narrative twist, but a seismic shift in the fabric of the entire show. This was not the Michael viewers remembered, the idealistic, morally grounded son of Carly and the late A.J. Quartermaine, the man who had so often tried to rise above the chaos that surrounded him. No, this was a different Michael. Hardened. Reborn. He wore his silence like armor, and his gaze was filled with the weight of betrayal, revelation, and the scars of a long, unseen journey. This Michael had walked through fire, abandoned, hidden away, and presumed lost, only to return with the clarity and rage of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. Inside the grand ballroom of the Nurses' Ball, as chandeliers sparkled above and cameras flashed in every direction, Carly stood in conversation with high-profile guests and longtime allies. She was poised, smiling, gracious as always, but the moment the side door creaked open and Michael appeared, her entire world tilted on its axis. For one suspended heartbeat, time itself seemed to halt. Her eyes locked onto his, and a gasp escaped her lips before she could control it. The hall fell into a hush so deep it was deafening. Michael, her son, whom she feared she had lost forever, was standing just feet away, alive, whole, and somehow changed. The reunion between mother and son was not loud or dramatic, it didn't need to be. With tears brimming in her eyes, Carly rushed forward and wrapped Michael in a tight, desperate embrace, burying her face against his shoulder as if to make sure he was real. It was a moment that transcended words. A universal testament to love, to survival, to the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. But even in that embrace, it was clear, Michael hadn't come home simply for comfort or closure. He had returned with a purpose burning in his chest and an agenda that would send shockwaves throughout Port Charles. Because behind the emotion of the moment lay a much darker undercurrent. Michael had spent his time away uncovering layers of deception, manipulation, and betrayal that implicated the very people who now smiled publicly while hiding their secrets. His reappearance at the Nurses' Ball was not just a family reunion, it was the first strategic move in a calculated reckoning. While Carly wept with relief, others in the room began to squirm in their seats. Michael's sudden, unannounced return had thrown carefully constructed alliances into chaos. People who believed themselves secure, in control, untouchable, were now at the mercy of a man who had nothing to lose. Most noticeably affected were Willow and Drew, whose expressions morphed from joy to confusion to something bordering on dread as they saw Michael stride across the ballroom floor. This was not the man they remembered. He was not seeking their forgiveness, nor their explanations. He had seen enough, suffered enough, and learned enough to know exactly who had stood by him. And who had taken advantage of his absence. In that moment, with hundreds of guests watching and reporters capturing every second, Michael Corinthos had made his entrance not just as a returning character, but as the catalyst for the next era of General Hospital, an era where truth would surface, lies would crumble, and those who thought they had buried him would come to regret ever turning their backs. Michael's arrival marked the end of speculation. And the beginning of something far more explosive. While the majority of the audience at the nurses' ball erupted in emotion, tears, applause, and disbelief, a chilling stillness gripped two people in the crowd who could not mask their discomfort, Willow and Drew. The moment Michael stepped into the spotlight, every carefully constructed illusion they had clung to began to crumble beneath the weight of reality. For Willow, the sight of him was nothing short of paralyzing. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart stilled, and her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. She had finally begun to believe she could move on. She had convinced herself that Michael was gone, that the silence meant abandonment, and that starting over with Drew was her only path forward. But now, standing mere feet away, was the man she had once loved more than anything, returning not as the wounded soul she remembered, but as someone transformed, someone she no longer recognized. It wasn't just Michael's presence that shook her. It was the way he looked at her. His eyes, once so full of warmth, understanding, and unwavering love, now radiated only disappointment and icy detachment. Gone was the man who would have done anything to protect her. In his place stood someone hardened by betrayal and isolation, someone who no longer sought comfort or answers, but only truth and consequences. That look cut deeper than any words could. It pierced through the walls of justification she had built, tearing down every excuse she had made for herself and for Drew. Drew, on the other hand, felt the suffocating grip of anxiety constricting around him. Every confident step he had taken in the months prior now echoed with the hollow sound of deception. He had manipulated the narrative, cast himself as the hero in Willow's life, and carefully curated an image of stability and protection. In Michael's absence, he seized the opportunity to become indispensable, to position himself as the only man Willow could lean on. But deep down, Drew always feared this day might come. And now, that fear was standing before him in the flesh, eyes sharp with knowledge, and carrying the weight of everything Drew had tried to bury. What Drew did not anticipate was that Michael's return would not be fueled by speculation or blind anger, but by hard, irrefutable evidence. Michael wasn't just back. He had come prepared. Hidden beneath the tailored suit and composed demeanor was a bombshell waiting to explode. In his possession were documents, audio recordings, and sworn statements from medical professionals, all pointing to a shocking and damning truth. During his disappearance, Michael had been involuntarily held at a remote rehabilitation facility, isolated from his family and the world, under the legal authorization of someone claiming to be his closest kin. That someone was Drew. Willow's face drained of all color as the realization hit her like a freight train. She hadn't been abandoned by Michael. She had been deceived. Every doubt she had nursed, every story she had been told to explain his absence, every moment she spent trying to convince herself that Drew was the better man, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by someone she trusted. Drew hadn't just filled a void, he had created it. And now, the man she had mourned was standing in front of her with the receipts. But the scandal didn't stop there. Michael revealed that Drew had also orchestrated a scheme to frame Nina by planting ketamine among her belongings, an act that not only cost Nina her credibility and legal standing but also poisoned Willow's perception of her own mother. The depth of Drew's manipulation was staggering. Every move he had made was designed to isolate Willow. To sever her emotional ties, control her decisions, and rebuild her life in a mold that served his ambitions. He positioned himself as her savior while methodically dismantling every other relationship in her life. And yet, the cruelest twist of fate was that Drew truly believed he had succeeded. He thought he had rewritten the story. But what he didn't know was that Michael had been watching, learning, and waiting. With the help of allies both inside and outside of Port Charles, Michael had slowly pieced together the truth of his own disappearance, unraveling the sinister web Drew had spun. The moment he stepped into the nurses' ball, he wasn't just reclaiming his identity, he was declaring war. For Willow, the emotional fallout was instantaneous and overwhelming. She had built her new life on a foundation of lies, and now the ground beneath her feet was giving way. Every embrace she had shared with Drew, every moment of solace, every whispered promise, it all turned to ash in the face of Michael's revelations. She felt betrayed not just by Drew, but by herself, for believing, for surrendering, for turning her back on the man who had never stopped fighting for her even when he had no voice. As the truth unfurled in the most public of arenas, Willow's inner world shattered. Her trust, her choices, her perception of right and wrong, everything was now suspect. And in the aftermath of Michael's return, there would be no simple apologies, no tidy resolutions. This was the beginning of an unraveling. Of loyalties fractured. Of relationships tested beyond recognition. And at the center of it all stood Michael, silent, strong, and resolute, not as a victim, but as a man determined to reclaim what had been taken from him. And in that moment, as the glittering lights of the nurses' ball shimmered over tear-streaked faces and hushed whispers filled the hall, one truth was impossible to ignore: Port Charles would never be the same again. While Willow spiraled into a state of emotional collapse, her breath shallow, her thoughts frantic, and her entire reality unraveling in real time, Drew clung desperately to the facade he had so carefully built. He stood with rigid posture, hands clenched tightly at his sides, trying to maintain an air of control. But the mask was slipping. His usually confident gaze darted anxiously around the room, and a thin sheen of sweat coated his brow. The weight of exposure bore down on him like a vice, and the signs of panic, though subtle, were unmistakable. The empire he had constructed, brick by manipulative brick, was beginning to collapse before his eyes. Whispers rippled through the ballroom like wildfire, spreading doubt and disbelief faster than any formal announcement could. News outlets, tipped off by attendees already live-streaming the scandal, ran with sensational headlines: Heir returns from exile, Michael Corinthos was institutionalized without consent, Corinthos' son framed. Drew Kane under fire. And worst of all for Drew, corporate sponsors pull funding amid nurses' ball scandal. The reputational damage was not only personal. It was political, financial, and far-reaching. Within minutes, some of the nurses' ball's biggest donors began discreetly pulling out. Public relations teams scrambled. PR representatives whispered frantically into cell phones. By the hour's end, the sparkle of the ball had faded into the somber hue of disgrace. Carly, meanwhile, moved with purpose through the chaos. No longer just the protective mother, she was now the strategist behind Michael's resurgence. She crossed the ballroom floor quietly, gracefully, and stood beside her son, not in front of him, not shielding him, but beside him, as an equal and an ally. In a silent exchange heavy with emotion and understanding, she handed Michael the metaphorical reins. Legal documents, media strategies, witness statements, and internal memos, all had been carefully compiled. With a slight nod, Carly made it clear, Michael now had complete control over how this story would unfold. The days of silence were over. It was time for action. And then, just as the room began to settle into an eerie silence, Michael stepped forward once more. The spotlight returned to him, not because he sought it, but because the truth demanded it. Standing tall with unshakable poise, Michael addressed the crowd in a tone that was calm, measured, and devastating in its finality. The man who once wore his heart on his sleeve now spoke with the authority of someone who had walked through fire and come out tempered like steel. In one of the most unforgettable moments in General Hospital history, Michael declared his intention to reclaim full custody of his children. No longer willing to allow others to shape their future in his absence, he announced he would petition the court to launch an immediate investigation into Drew Kane's abuse of legal power, psychological manipulation, and deliberate obstruction of familial ties. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't flinch. Every word carried the precision of a scalpel, and the finality of a gavel. The message was clear: the days of deceit were done. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Willow, trembling, covered her mouth as she sank further into her seat, the enormity of the moment crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Drew stood frozen, as if the floor beneath him might give way at any second. His carefully cultivated image, the savior, the protector, the doting partner, had been shattered in front of Port Charles's elite. And Michael had done it all without raising his voice, without revenge-fueled theatrics. He didn't need rage to destroy Drew, he had the truth. This was not the Michael of old. The idealistic, wounded soul who once sought peace in a town defined by conflict had evolved into something far more formidable, a man forged in silence and shaped by betrayal. His return was not a plea for reconciliation, it was a reckoning. He didn't come back to rebuild the life that was taken from him. He came back to build a new one, stronger, wiser, and no longer vulnerable to those who mistook his kindness for weakness. In the aftermath of his announcement, chaos erupted. Reporters surged forward with questions. Family members argued in hushed but urgent tones. Security staff attempted to restore order. But Michael remained still, composed, unbothered. The storm could rage around him, he had already weathered worse in isolation. The difference now was that he had his voice back, and with it, the power to dismantle the lies that had consumed Port Charles in his absence. And as the ballroom's shimmering lights flickered above the tension-filled crowd, a new reality settled in for everyone present. Michael Corinthos was no longer a passive player in someone else's game. He was now the one setting the rules. Port Charles had never witnessed a return as thunderous and seismic as Michael's. In a town that had seen countless betrayals, scandals, and dramatic confrontations, nothing quite matched the intensity and precision of this moment. Beneath the dazzling lights of the nurses' ball, with the music still playing in the background like a haunting score, the truth unfolded like a violent storm sweeping through every corner of the room. Michael's presence wasn't just a reunion, it was a reckoning. He returned not merely as a father reclaiming his children, or a son reuniting with his family, but as a force determined to dismantle the very architecture of manipulation and deceit that had taken root in Port Charles during his absence. In doing so, he had become a new power player, someone whose silence had forged steel and whose words now carried the weight of justice. For Willow, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. Her hesitation, her misplaced trust in Drew, her willingness to believe the carefully crafted lies, those decisions had cost her dearly. The chance to make things right, to stand beside Michael and undo the damage, had passed her by. All that remained now was a bitter clarity, a recognition that she had been used, and that Michael had seen it all. Drew, the man who once wore the mask of protector, now stood stripped of all pretense. His elaborate schemes had unraveled spectacularly in front of an entire town, and there was no salvaging what was lost. He would no longer be able to manipulate the narrative, hide behind legal documents, or charm his way out of consequences. The mirror had been held up to his soul, and what stared back was a man who would finally have to confront the truth he thought he could bury. And as the final curtain of the evening drew to a close, and the guests slowly filtered out in stunned silence, only one name lingered in the air: Michael. It echoed in whispers, in gasps, in the stunned expressions of those who had underestimated him. He had risen from the ashes, not as a victim of circumstance, but as an agent of consequence. The man once cast aside had returned with a flame in his heart and a mission in his eyes. A flame powerful enough to burn down the lies, the betrayals, and the darkness that had once swallowed him whole. In Port Charles, a new chapter had begun, and it was Michael who now held the pen.